The night he did look back. The night Keanu Reeves walked away was not loud, dramatic, or filled with cameras flashing the way people might imagine moments like that to be. It was quiet, almost painfully so, the kind of silence that settles into your bones when the world has finally stopped asking you to perform. Rain had begun falling over Los Angeles in a slow, patient rhythm, coating the streets in a reflective glow that made the city feel distant, unreal, as if it were watching itself from far away. Inside the studio, voices rose and fell with celebration, congratulations echoing through hallways lined with posters and awards, but Keanu had already slipped away before the noise could touch him. He moved through the exit without a word, his coat pulled tight around him, his shoulders slightly hunched as though he were trying to carry less of himself into the night. For years he had learned how to smile when expected, how to listen when praised, how to nod politely while parts of him quietly retreated inward, but tonight, something inside him refused to play along. He didn't feel broken, not exactly, but he felt empty in a way that scared him more than pain ever had, and the only instinct he trusted was the oldest one he had: walk away, find quiet, breathe again. Sandra Bullock noticed the moment he left, not because he made a scene, but because he didn't. She had known him long enough to recognize the subtle signs most people missed, the way his eyes lingered too long on nothing, the way his smile arrived a second late, the way silence followed him like a shadow when the world got too loud. She stood among the laughter, holding a glass she hadn't touched, watching the doorway where he had disappeared, and something in her chest tightened with a familiar concern she couldn't ignore. This wasn't about a bad day or exhaustion from work. This was the look of someone who had carried too much kindness for too long without letting himself rest. For a moment, she tried to convince herself it wasn't her place to intervene, that he needed space, that he would be fine, but the feeling wouldn't leave her. It whispered instead, reminding her of every quiet conversation they had ever shared, every moment when he listened more than he spoke, every time he showed up for others without asking for anything in return. And so, without announcing it to anyone, without grabbing attention or making excuses, Sandra set her glass down, picked up her coat, and followed him out into the rain. Outside, the city felt different, stripped of its glamour, honest in its emptiness. The rain softened the edges of everything, muting sounds, blurring lights, turning the street into a long ribbon of reflection. She spotted him ahead, walking slowly, hands in his pockets, his head lowered as if the weight of years pressed gently but firmly on his shoulders. She called his name once, but the rain swallowed her voice, and he didn't turn back. For a brief second, she hesitated, standing under the awning with rain tapping against her umbrella, wondering if this was the moment she should stop, let him disappear into the night the way he so often did. But her heart refused to cooperate. She stepped forward instead, her pace quickening, water soaking the hem of her coat until the distance between them finally closed. He stopped then, not turning to face her right away, just standing there as the rain continued to fall, as if he had known all along she would follow. "You didn't have to come," he said quietly, his voice calm but tired, the kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep but from carrying invisible weight day after day. "I know," Sandra replied just as softly, adjusting her umbrella so it covered him too, even though it meant the rain brushed her shoulder. "But I did." He glanced at her then, and for a moment the streetlight caught his expression, revealing something raw and unguarded before he could hide it again. "Sometimes walking away feels easier than explaining," he said, almost to himself. "Sometimes," she answered, meeting his gaze without pressure or judgment, "walking alone just makes the quiet louder." The words hung between them, mixing with the rain, settling into the space where excuses usually lived. Keanu exhaled slowly, a breath he didn't seem to realize he had been holding, and for the first time that night, he didn't move forward. He didn't retreat either. He simply stood there, present, as the noise from the studio faded into memory and the city stretched endlessly around them. In that moment, nothing had been solved, no grand decisions made, no promises spoken, but something important had begun without either of them naming it. The night he walked away was also the night someone followed without a word, and in that quiet choice, the story truly began. The silence between steps. The rain did not stop when they began walking together, but it softened, as though the night itself was listening, and with each step they took side by side, the distance between what they felt and what they allowed themselves to say grew thinner. Keanu walked with his hands still in his pockets, his pace steady but unhurried, as if he were afraid that moving too fast would break the fragile calm that had settled around them. Sandra stayed close without crowding him, matching his rhythm instinctively, the sound of their footsteps blending with the rain until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Neither of them spoke for several minutes, not because there was nothing to say, but because both understood that some moments needed space before words could exist inside them. The city lights stretched long across the wet pavement, and passing cars became distant shapes, unimportant, temporary, while something quieter and more permanent unfolded between two people who had spent years pretending they were unaffected by the weight they carried. Keanu was the first to break the silence, though his voice was so calm it almost blended into the rain. He spoke about exhaustion, not the kind that comes from work or schedules, but the deeper kind that settles into a person who is constantly expected to be steady, kind, and composed no matter how heavy the world becomes. He admitted that lately, even kindness had begun to feel like a responsibility instead of a choice, something people admired from a distance but never truly understood up close, because they did not see the cost of holding yourself together when everyone else leaned on you. Sandra listened without interrupting, her expression soft but attentive, knowing better than to rush him or offer solutions where none were needed. She had seen this quiet struggle in him before, the way he absorbed pain without complaint, the way he gave warmth freely but rarely asked for it in return, and hearing him speak it aloud felt less like a confession and more like a release he had delayed for far too long. They stopped at a crosswalk where the light glowed red, casting a faint reflection across their faces, and Sandra finally spoke, telling him that strength was not measured by how much you endure in silence, but by how honestly you allow yourself to be seen when you are tired. Her words were not dramatic or rehearsed, just honest, spoken with the calm certainty of someone who had learned the same lesson through her own quiet battles. Keanu looked at her then, really looked at her, as if realizing for the first time that she was not following him to rescue him or pull him back into the noise, but simply to remind him that he did not have to disappear to find peace. Something in his expression shifted, subtle but real, and he nodded slowly, acknowledging a truth he had resisted for years because it felt too vulnerable to accept. They eventually found themselves in front of a small diner that looked almost forgotten by time, its neon sign flickering softly against the dark sky. Inside, the warmth felt immediate and grounding, wrapping around them as they slid into a booth near the window, steam rising from their coats as the rain continued outside. The waitress greeted them without recognition, without excitement, just a simple smile and 2 mugs of coffee placed gently on the table, and that normalcy felt more comforting than any praise either of them had received all night. Keanu wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the heat sink into his palms, and for the first time since leaving the studio, his shoulders relaxed slightly, as though his body had finally been given permission to rest. Sandra watched him quietly, noticing the small details most people overlooked, the way his breathing slowed, the way his gaze softened as he stared out the window at nothing in particular, and she realized that this, not awards or applause, was what he had been searching for. She spoke about her own moments of doubt, the times she questioned whether being open-hearted in an industry built on expectations and appearances was worth the emotional cost, and admitted that there were nights she, too, wanted to step away from everything and disappear somewhere quiet. Her honesty surprised him, not because he doubted her strength, but because he understood how difficult it was to admit weariness in a world that constantly demanded resilience. As the diner slowly emptied and the rain outside eased into a gentle mist, Keanu felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, not relief, not happiness, but a sense of being understood without needing to explain himself further. He realized that walking away had never truly given him peace, only temporary distance, and that perhaps what he had been avoiding all along was not the noise of the world, but the vulnerability of staying present when someone saw him clearly. Sandra said nothing as the moment stretched, sensing that whatever he was processing needed silence more than reassurance, and when he finally looked up, there was gratitude in his eyes, quiet and sincere. When they stood to leave, dawn had begun to hint at the edges of the sky, softening the darkness with pale light, and as they stepped back outside, the city felt transformed, less overwhelming, more human. Keanu paused for a moment on the sidewalk, breathing in the cool air, and Sandra stood beside him without asking questions, without expectations, simply there. In that stillness, he understood something important, that the night he walked away was not an ending, but the beginning of a different kind of journey, one where silence could be shared, where kindness did not have to be lonely, and where walking forward did not require walking alone. And though neither of them said it aloud, both felt it, the quiet certainty that whatever came next would change them in ways they were only just beginning to understand. Where quiet begins to speak. Morning arrived gently, not with urgency, but with patience, as if the world itself understood that whatever was unfolding between them could not be rushed. The sky over the city shifted from deep blue to soft gray, and the streets, still damp from the night's rain, reflected the pale light in long, broken lines. Keanu stood near the edge of a small overlook just beyond the diner, hands resting against the cool metal railing, his eyes fixed on the horizon where buildings faded into mist. Sandra remained a few steps behind him, not out of distance, but out of respect, sensing that the silence he carried now was different from the one that had followed him earlier. This silence was not an escape. It was a reckoning. For the first time in a long while, Keanu was not running from the weight inside him. He was standing still long enough to feel it fully, and that realization unsettled him more than exhaustion ever had. As the city slowly woke, memories surfaced without warning, quiet and persistent. Moments from years past when he had chosen kindness even when it cost him something. Moments when he had smiled through pain because it was easier than explaining it. Moments when people praised his humility without realizing how heavy humility can become when it is never balanced by rest. He thought about how often he had stepped aside so others could shine, how frequently he had given pieces of himself away without asking whether he had anything left to spare. Standing there now, with the cool air brushing his face, he understood that the urge to walk away had never been about rejecting the world, but about protecting what little remained of his inner stillness. The difference was subtle but important, and for the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge it without guilt. Sandra eventually stepped closer, her presence calm and grounding, and spoke softly about how she had learned that walking beside someone does not mean fixing them, but trusting them enough to let them find their own balance. She admitted that she had followed him that night not out of fear that he would disappear forever, but because she recognized the look of someone who had forgotten how to rest without feeling selfish. Her honesty landed gently, not as a confrontation, but as an invitation, and Keanu felt something shift again, a quiet permission he had never granted himself before. He turned toward her slowly, his expression thoughtful, and said that he had spent most of his life believing peace was something you found alone, somewhere far from expectation. But now he wondered whether peace might actually grow in shared silence, in moments where nothing is demanded and nothing needs to be proven. They decided to leave the city for a while, not as an escape, but as a pause, a space where the noise of expectations could loosen its grip. The drive out of Los Angeles felt surreal in its simplicity, traffic thinning as buildings gave way to open stretches of road and low hills bathed in early light. Keanu drove without speaking, one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting loosely by his side, while Sandra watched the scenery pass, feeling the tension between them ease not through words, but through shared stillness. There was something deeply human about the way the road unfolded ahead of them, unassuming and honest, offering no promises except forward motion. And for the first time in years, Keanu did not feel chased by the future or anchored to the past. He felt present. They stopped near a quiet stretch of land where the air smelled of earth and morning, and the only sounds were distant birds and the wind moving through tall grass. Keanu stepped out of the car and stood there for a long moment, breathing deeply, as though testing whether the calm would disappear if he acknowledged it. Sandra joined him, her expression softened by the openness of the space, and together they stood without speaking, allowing the quiet to do what words could not. In that moment, Keanu realized how rarely he allowed himself to simply exist without purpose, without responsibility, without the unspoken obligation to be strong for everyone else. The realization was both comforting and unsettling, because it meant admitting how long he had denied himself that simple grace. Later, as they sat on a weathered bench overlooking the open land, Keanu spoke again, his voice steady but reflective about the fear that came with slowing down, the fear that if he stopped giving so much, the world might forget him, or worse, judge him for choosing himself. Sandra listened, then gently reminded him that being remembered for kindness did not require self-destruction, and that true generosity includes knowing when to protect your own spirit. Her words were not advice, but understanding, and Keanu felt the truth of them settle quietly inside him, replacing a belief he had carried for far too long. As the sun climbed higher, warmth spreading across the land, Keanu understood that something fundamental had begun to change. He was no longer searching for a place to disappear. He was learning how to stay without losing himself. Sandra sensed it too, the subtle shift in his posture, the ease returning to his movements, the way his gaze no longer drifted restlessly but lingered with intention. They did not name what was happening between them, because names felt unnecessary and perhaps too fragile for something that needed time to grow. What mattered was that the silence they shared no longer felt heavy or empty. It felt alive, purposeful, and full of possibility. When they finally stood to leave, the road ahead felt less intimidating, not because it promised answers, but because it no longer felt lonely. Keanu glanced at Sandra with quiet gratitude, not spoken aloud, but deeply felt, and she returned the look with the calm assurance of someone who understood that sometimes the most meaningful support is simply staying present when someone is brave enough to stop running. And as they drove forward together, the city now far behind them, Keanu realized that the quiet he had been searching for was not something to escape into, but something to build, step by step, with honesty, patience, and the courage to remain. When kindness is tested, the calm they had found outside the city did not vanish suddenly. Instead, it was tested quietly, the way real life always does, not with dramatic warnings, but with small moments that demand choice. By late afternoon, clouds gathered again, heavier than before, stretching across the sky as Keanu and Sandra drove deeper into unfamiliar territory, following a narrow road that curved gently through low hills and scattered trees. The silence inside the car felt different now, not fragile, but attentive, as if both were aware that peace is never permanent, only practiced. Keanu's thoughts drifted inward as he watched the landscape unfold, realizing that slowing down had allowed memories and emotions he had long avoided to rise naturally to the surface, not as burdens, but as reminders of who he was beneath the expectations. Sandra noticed the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his eyes sharpened with focus, and she understood without asking that the quiet inside him was shifting again, preparing him for something unseen. They stopped briefly at a small roadside market, unremarkable in every way, its wooden structure weathered by years of sun and wind, its shelves lined with basic goods and handwritten price signs. The simplicity of the place felt grounding, almost comforting, and as they stepped out of the car, the air smelled of dust and warm earth. Inside, an elderly man worked the register slowly, his movements deliberate, his eyes tired but kind. As Keanu paid for a bottle of water, he noticed a young woman nearby arguing softly with the man, her voice tight with worry. She explained that she was short on money, that her car had broken down miles away, that she only needed enough fuel to get home. The man listened patiently but shook his head, apologetic, bound by rules he could not bend without consequence. Keanu watched quietly, not intervening right away, feeling the familiar pull in his chest that always appeared in moments like this, the instinct to help colliding with the awareness that kindness often carries unseen costs. Without drawing attention, Keanu placed extra cash on the counter, enough to cover her needs and more, and stepped aside as though it were nothing, as though this small act were as natural as breathing. The woman noticed only when the man called her back, surprise and relief washing over her face as she turned, searching for the source. Keanu met her gaze briefly and nodded once, gently, not seeking gratitude or recognition. Sandra watched the exchange from a distance, feeling both admiration and concern settle in her chest, because she knew this pattern too well. Kindness came easily to him, almost effortlessly, but the weight of it never showed until later, when exhaustion crept in quietly, demanding payment. As they returned to the car, Sandra finally spoke, her tone careful, not accusatory, but honest. She asked whether he ever worried that giving so much would eventually leave him empty again, that the same instinct that made him good could also make him vulnerable. Keanu considered her words as he started the engine, the sound low and steady, and admitted that he thought about it often, especially now, when he was trying to learn how to stay present without losing himself. He confessed that the fear was not in helping others, but in becoming invisible again, reduced to a symbol instead of a person, expected to give endlessly without being allowed to falter. Sandra listened closely, understanding that this was not doubt, but awareness, a necessary step in learning how to protect what mattered most. As the road grew narrower and the light began to fade, they encountered an unexpected disruption ahead, a small accident where a car had slid partially off the road, its hazard lights blinking weakly against the dimming sky. A man stood beside it, frustrated and overwhelmed, pacing back and forth as rain threatened to fall again. Keanu slowed the car instinctively, pulling over without hesitation, and Sandra felt a familiar mix of pride and worry as they stepped out. The man explained that his phone had no signal, that he had been stuck for hours, unsure what to do. Keanu listened calmly, assessing the situation with quiet focus, and together they worked to push the car back onto stable ground, their clothes damp, their hands cold, but their movements steady and purposeful. When it was done, the man thanked them repeatedly, his relief obvious, and as he drove away, Keanu stood there for a moment longer, watching the taillights disappear into the distance. Sandra noticed the way he exhaled slowly, the way his shoulders dropped slightly, and she understood that moments like this, while meaningful, also pulled at him in ways he rarely acknowledged. She reminded him gently that it was okay to stop sometimes, that being kind did not require constant proof, and for the first time he didn't deflect her concern. Instead, he nodded, quietly accepting the idea that kindness could exist alongside boundaries, that one did not cancel out the other. As night settled fully around them and the first stars appeared faintly through the clouds, Keanu felt something shift again, subtler than before but just as significant. He realized that the world would always test him, always present opportunities to give, to step forward, to be the person others needed in moments of crisis. But the real challenge lay not in saying yes, but in learning when to rest, when to lean on someone else, when to allow himself the same compassion he offered so freely. Sandra sensed this understanding forming within him, and though she said nothing, her presence felt like quiet reinforcement, a reminder that he was not meant to carry everything alone. They drove on in silence, the road illuminated only by headlights and the soft glow of the dashboard, and Keanu felt the weight he had carried for so long begin to redistribute, no longer pressing entirely on his own shoulders. He did not feel cured, nor did he feel complete, but he felt honest, and that honesty felt like the beginning of something sustainable, something real. The night stretched ahead, full of uncertainty, but also full of possibility, and as they moved forward together, Keanu understood that kindness, when practiced with awareness and shared responsibility, did not have to lead to disappearance. It could lead, instead, to endurance. The choice that cannot be undone. Night settled fully over the road as they continued driving, the darkness outside broken only by the steady sweep of headlights and the quiet rhythm of tires against pavement. And within that enclosed space, Keanu felt something tightening again, not panic, but the familiar pressure of a decision forming whether he wanted it to or not. The calm he had been learning to trust was now being challenged by a deeper question, one he had avoided for years because it required more courage than walking away ever had. Sandra sensed it immediately, the shift in his posture, the way his grip on the steering wheel grew firmer, the way his silence deepened, and though she did not interrupt him, her presence felt steady, anchoring, like a reminder that he did not have to face whatever was coming alone. Keanu's thoughts drifted toward the life he had built, the one people admired from a distance, filled with achievements and quiet generosity, yet also marked by solitude and constant retreat. He realized that walking away had always been his way of maintaining control, of deciding when the world could reach him and when it could not, but now that instinct felt incomplete. Staying, truly staying, meant accepting vulnerability, allowing others to see him not just as a symbol of kindness, but as a human being who could grow tired, who could hesitate, who could need reassurance without losing dignity. The realization unsettled him deeply, because it meant that peace was no longer something he could chase alone in quiet places. It was something he had to build within connection, and that required trust he was not sure he had fully learned how to give. They stopped for the night at a small, unassuming motel along the highway, the kind of place travelers passed through without leaving traces behind. Inside the room, the lighting was soft and warm, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence between them as they set their bags down. Sandra sat near the window, watching the distant lights flicker outside, while Keanu stood near the door, his thoughts heavy, his chest tight with everything he had not yet said. The simplicity of the room felt almost symbolic, stripped of distractions, leaving no place to hide from what was rising inside him. After a long moment, he finally spoke, his voice low and measured, admitting that he was afraid not of the world, but of staying in it without armor, afraid that if he stopped retreating, the pain he had carefully kept at a distance would find its way back in. Sandra listened without judgment, her expression calm but deeply attentive, and when she responded, her words carried the weight of quiet truth rather than comfort. She told him that fear was not a sign he was weak, but proof that he was standing at the edge of something honest, something that mattered enough to risk disappointment. She reminded him that disappearing had protected him once, but that protection had come at a cost, slowly shrinking the parts of his life where connection could grow. Her honesty did not push him toward a decision. It simply illuminated the consequences of each path, leaving the choice where it belonged, firmly in his hands. Later that night, unable to sleep, Keanu stepped outside onto the narrow walkway overlooking the empty parking lot, the cool air brushing against his face as he stared up at the wide, unbroken sky. He thought about the people he had helped, the strangers whose lives briefly intersected with his own, and realized that while those moments mattered, they had never asked him to stay. Staying meant something different. It meant allowing someone to witness his uncertainty, to stand beside him not because he was needed, but because he was chosen. The thought frightened him more than any crowd or camera ever had, because it stripped away the illusion of control he had relied on for so long. Sandra joined him quietly, wrapping a light jacket around herself, standing close without touching, and together they looked at the sky in silence. Keanu finally turned to her and spoke the truth he had been circling all night, admitting that part of him still wanted to leave everything behind, to find a place where no one expected anything of him, where kindness could exist without demand. But another part of him, when he could no longer ignore, wanted to stay, not just in the world, but in the moments that felt real, even when they were uncomfortable. Saying it aloud felt like crossing a line he could not step back from, and as the words settled between them, the night seemed to hold its breath. Sandra did not rush to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, carrying neither pressure nor promise, only presence. She told him that whatever he chose, it had to be something he could live with honestly, not something shaped by guilt or expectation, and that staying did not mean giving everything away again. It meant choosing connection without losing himself, choosing balance instead of sacrifice. Her words did not solve his conflict, but they reframed it, shifting the question from whether he could endure the world to whether he could trust himself to remain whole within it. As dawn began to hint faintly at the horizon, Keanu felt clarity arrive quietly, not as certainty, but as resolve. He understood that walking away would always be an option, that the road would always be there, offering escape, but staying required intention, patience, and the willingness to be seen imperfectly. He turned to Sandra, his expression calm but serious, and told her that for the first time he wanted to try something different, not because he was finished running, but because he was finished hiding. The decision did not feel triumphant or dramatic. It felt grounded, heavy, and real, the kind of choice that reshapes a life not through sudden change, but through sustained presence. As the first light of morning spread across the sky, Keanu realized that whatever came next would test him in new ways, ways he could no longer avoid, but for the first time the thought did not exhaust him. It steadied him. The night had asked its hardest question, and though the answer was still unfolding, he had finally stopped turning away from it. The night he stayed. Morning arrived without ceremony, as if the world itself understood that this moment did not need to announce itself to be important. And as pale light spread slowly across the parking lot, Keanu stood by the edge of the motel walkway, breathing in air that felt cleaner than it had in years. The choice he had made during the long hours of darkness did not feel final in the way people imagined decisions should, sharp and dramatic, but instead settled inside him like a quiet promise, steady and unyielding. For so long, he had measured peace by distance, by how far he could place himself from expectation and noise. Yet now he understood that real peace demanded presence, the courage to remain where life was happening, even when it felt uncertain or uncomfortable. Sandra joined him without a word, standing beside him as naturally as if she had always been there. And in that shared stillness, Keanu felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time, a sense of belonging that did not require performance, explanation, or retreat. They drove again as the day unfolded, not toward a destination that promised escape, but toward the city they had left behind, and though the road looked the same, it felt entirely different. Keanu watched the horizon steadily, aware that returning did not mean surrendering himself to the same patterns that once drained him, but rather stepping back with intention, boundaries, and a clearer understanding of who he was choosing to be. Sandra spoke occasionally, not to fill the silence, but to anchor it, sharing thoughts about balance, about how strength and softness are not opposites but companions, about how staying does not mean giving everything away, but learning when to give and when to hold back. Her words did not instruct him. They affirmed what he was already beginning to understand, that kindness, when rooted in self-respect, does not diminish a person but sustains them. As the city came back into view, Keanu felt the familiar weight stir again, but this time it did not overwhelm him. Instead, it reminded him of something essential, that the world would continue to ask, to pull, to test, and that his task was not to disappear from it, but to meet it honestly without losing himself. They stopped briefly at a small overlook before entering the city, and Keanu stepped out, gazing at the vastness below, realizing that his life had never been small, only fragmented by the ways he tried to protect himself. Sandra stood nearby, watching him quietly, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried calm certainty rather than doubt. He admitted that he had spent years believing his worth came from how much he could endure, how little he demanded in return, and that walking away had felt noble because it spared others from seeing his exhaustion. Now, he understood that allowing himself to stay, to be seen as imperfect and human, was not weakness, but responsibility to his own life. When they reached the studio again later that day, the noise returned in waves, familiar and chaotic. But Keanu moved through it differently now, greeting people politely, listening when necessary, but no longer shrinking himself to fit expectations that were never meant to define him. Sandra watched from a short distance, noticing the subtle changes that only someone who truly knew him would see, the way his posture remained open, the way his smile was quieter but more genuine, the way he no longer looked for the nearest exit. There was no announcement, no speech, no dramatic declaration of change, and that was what made it real. He stayed not because the world asked him to, but because he chose to remain present within it. Later that evening, as the day finally released its hold, they found themselves walking again, this time through familiar streets, the city alive but no longer oppressive. Keanu realized that the night he had walked away had not been a failure or a breaking point, but a necessary pause, a moment where silence taught him what noise never could. He turned to Sandra and thanked her, not for following him, but for trusting him enough to let him find his own way back, and she smiled in that quiet, knowing way that spoke of understanding rather than pride. She told him that sometimes the most powerful support is not stopping someone from leaving, but being there when they decide to stay. As night settled once more over the city, Keanu felt complete in a way he had never known before, not because everything was resolved, but because he was finally aligned with himself. He no longer saw walking away as the only path to peace, nor did he see staying as a sacrifice. Instead, he understood that peace was something he could carry with him, built through honesty, boundaries, and the courage to remain present even when life demanded more than comfort. Standing beside Sandra, feeling the hum of the city beneath their feet, he realized that the story was never about leaving or being followed, but about learning that silence does not have to mean isolation, and that staying, truly staying, can be the bravest act of all. And so the night ended not with disappearance, but with grounding, not with escape, but with resolve. Keanu Reeves did not walk away again, not because the world changed, but because he did, choosing to live fully where he stood, carrying kindness not as a burden, but as a shared strength. In that choice, quiet and steady, his life moved forward not toward noise or retreat, but toward something far more rare and enduring, a peace that stayed.